Welcome to this session. It's on Mary Church Terrell, Lift as We Climb, Black Activism in the Nation's Capital. So I just want to share a little bit about who I am. My name is Elisa Hardy, and I am a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland. My research focuses on racial rhetorical criticism, particularly like rhetoric, digital media, and cultural studies. So it's at those intersections. But I am an instructor here at the University of Maryland. I teach Com 360, which is the rhetoric of Black America. And so some of the things a lot of the things I'll be talking about, particularly Terrell, her story, her history, and then we'll analyze one of her speeches. This comes from some of my work as a grad student and also as an instructor in this course. And so I first discovered Terrell's story, Mary Terrell's story, during a graduate studies course when I was tasked with finding a speech at the intersection of rhetoric, history, and activism. And so Terrell really caught my attention as a woman suffragist and a prominent leader in Black communities and intellectual circles. I was particularly intrigued by her rhetoric, particularly one of the speeches, which is called What It Means to Be Colored in the Capital of the United States, which I came across when I was looking through the Oberlin College archives. And so my interest as I delved into Terrell's use of Black women's rhetoric to advocate for social change, it led me to the DC History Conference. And so for 2 consecutive years, I participated in this conference, focusing on Terrell's activism in and around Washington, D.C. This experience really allowed me to showcase the importance of Terrell's work to a broader audience, emphasizing the impact of Black women in leadership roles and their contributions to racial uplift. And so just a little overview of the workshop. So we will first explore the life of Mary Church Terrell and trace the evolution of her activism in Washington, D.C. So I'll give you a brief history of who she is for folks who don't know her and why she is a prominent leader and of importance. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a group activity where we will read sections from the speech. Due to the time constraints of the workshops, we might not be able to get to the whole speech, but my hopes is that folks will kind of look around through the document and maybe comment and annotate on it through parts of the speech, and then we'll come together as a group to do like a discussion. And so lastly, I have some resources for learning more. So I created some resources based off of the papers that I've written on Terrell and some of the things that I found. And so I will offer that to you as well to use in your studies and your exploration of her story. Okay, so to kind of begin, born Mary Eliza Church. She was born in Memphis, Tennessee on September 23rd, 1863 during the Civil War, to Robert Reed Church and Louisa Church, who were both formerly enslaved people. The couple also had another child who's Terrell's brother, who's Thomas Church. And so Terrell was a light-skinned woman, a young girl with long, dark hair, dark curly hair. Her father was a wealthy businessman who later became one of the South's first African-American millionaires. And her mother was a successful owner of Memphis's hair salon and an artist in her leisure time. And so because of her parents' financial status, Terrell had the privilege of living in a very wealthy Black community and received an outstanding education. And so at 6 years old, Terrell moved to attend this preparatory school in Yellow Springs, Ohio. She was only a Black child among her classmates. And so after 2 years, she went to the model school, which was a public school, and then the model school, and then attended a public school in Yellow Springs. And then she enrolled in the public high school in Oberlin, Ohio, graduating in 1879. And so a little bit about her educational journey. So at the time during the late 19th century, Black women were not expected to have achieved academically, especially Black women who often dealt with race and gender discrimination. And so despite the impact of Jim Crow at the time, Terrell was one of the first Black women to earn a bachelor's degree in 1884 in classics and a master's degree in education in 1888 from Oberlin College, Ohio. And so she taught for 2 years at Wilberforce College in Ohio in 1885, teaching a variety of different courses and acting as the college secretary. She accepted a position in Latin department of the Colored High School in Washington, D.C. So in 1887, that's when she moved to D.C. But she took a leave of absence to spend time spend the years of 1888 to 1890 traveling and studying in France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and other places in Europe. And so here she frequently, when she was in Europe, she frequently attended plays and concerts and regularly practiced her languages. She kept diaries in French and German, really detailing her experiences and her activities and different friendships and encounters that she had. And her excellent education and travel to other states and countries in Europe really helped equip her for a career that began in teaching positions, but then continued with future leadership roles. And so she married Robert Terrell, who was a lawyer and a future judge. And they had their daughter, Phyllis, named after Phyllis Wheatley in 1898. And later she ended up adopting her brother's daughter, Mary. And so a little bit about her early activism. Terrell's early activism. So it was the lynching of Terrell's friend, and this was also Ida B. Wells' friend, Thomas Moss in Memphis in 1892 that really reinforced Terrell's and ignited Terrell's commitment to racial uplift and social justice activism. So Terrell was one of the founding members of the Colored Women's League, along with Anna Julia Cooper in 1892. And here she worked with various Black women who had organized this club to fight for rights, for Black women's rights and desegregation. Terrell worked vigorously for women's suffrage, and as I said, in fighting for Black women's rights. And she also chaired the education committee and taught courses in English, English literature and German. So she was both teaching and doing a lot of activism during this time. And so with that, racial uplift. And so Terrell was the first president of the National Association of Colored Women.
Three people a starting agency during Reconstruction. And what I would love is...
oh, I'm sorry. So to continue, Terrell was the first president of the National...
Oh, sorry, Lisa, you got muted.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'll keep going.
That was me, sorry.
Oh, it's all good. Thank you. So she was the first president of NACW in 1896, and other women, including Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, and Frances Ellen Watkins, were a part of this organization and took leadership roles. NACW became this architect of an expansive racial uplift infrastructure. So what they did a lot of mobilizing for voter registration. They promoted cultural events, including music concerts and poetry readings. They did fundraisings for different Black schools, especially focusing on like kindergarten and nurseries. They fought for equal rights for African Americans, challenging Jim Crow at the time. They searched for work opportunities and created work opportunities for Black women. They fought for women's suffrage, particularly Black women's right to vote. And they challenged the criminal justice system, including lynching at the time. So NACW did a lot of work, and Terrell was one of the leaders, first leaders of this organization. Terrell traveled around the world while she was doing this. She traveled around the world speaking as a public intellectual and racial thought leader. She often gave speaking tours that were initially kind of like in three-week increments, and she did a lot of traveling in the South. So at one point, she did a 7-week tour where she traveled to 25 cities, primarily in southern states like Alabama, Texas, and Louisiana, and Mississippi. And so, as I said before, she was fluent in German and French and Latin and in Greek. And she gave addresses in multiple languages, especially in German. And so she had this literal ability to speak in tongues, not only allowing her to communicate across different racial lines, but also kind of refract the audience gaze toward her being, a Black woman, that allowed them to really look at more of her intellectual thought as well. And so with that, the motto that Terrell created for NACW was "Lift as we climb." And so Terrell really helped raise awareness for Black people, but particularly Black women's struggle. And so I found this quote in one of Terrell's speeches, "The Progress of Colored Women," which he gave in February 1888 in Washington, D.C., before the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And she said, and so lifting as we climb, onward and upward, we go struggling and striving and hoping that the buds and blossoms of our desires will burst into glorious fruition ere long. With courage born of success achieved in the past, with a keen sense of the responsibility which we shall continue to assume, we look forward to a future large, with promise and hope. Seeking no favors because of our color, nor patronage because of our needs, we knock at the bar of justice, asking an equal chance. And so in this quote right here in particular, Terrell really expresses this commitment to progress, emphasizing the upward journey of self-improvement, but particularly collective improvement as well, resilience for Black women in the face of these challenges, and the hopeful anticipation of realizing their aspirations, all while demanding equal opportunities and justice for Black people. And so today we're going to be looking, as I said, at a speech of Mary Church Terrell's speech, what it means to be colored in the Capitol of the United States. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about where this project is kind of coming from. So the Recovering Democracy Archive, this is a digital archive that is dedicated to bringing lesser known yet significant speeches to light. The Recovering Democracy Archive is through the Roskin Center, which is particularly through the Department of Communication here at the University of Maryland. And so in one of my graduate courses, I created this unit that functions as a comprehensive resource offering insights into this recovered speech, providing historical context, and detailing information about copyrights. While our focus today is specifically on the speech itself, it's important to note that this unit can serve as a valuable resource for gaining a deeper understanding of the context surrounding the speech. So if you if you could drop the first link into the comments if you haven't already. She's going to put it in there for you all to kind of take a look at this unit that's online. And there are tons of other speeches that are on here as well, particularly if you're looking for speeches that were given by Black intellectuals during the 19th and 20th century. You can find more here. And so getting into the kind of weeds of the speech itself, just a little bit about the context. So particularly, there was this increase in Black presence in DC by the early 1900s. And so by the early 1900s, the US Census documented that of the 2,700,000 people living in the capital, Black people comprised of over 1/3 of the population. And so it became this like perception that DC was this color man's paradise, meaning that many white citizens started to perceive the nation's capital to be a place that granted Black people the leisure of white society. And so Terrell really sought to debunk this particular myth. Throughout her life, she spent over 50 years living in Washington, D.C., and often described the Capitol as far from paradise for colored people. Black people at this time were fighting for equal treatment. They were also fighting for respect in civic life and recognition for military service during the Civil War. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation nationwide, including in Washington, D.C., where Black people faced various restrictions from voting to education and employment and were subject to racial violence. And so Terrell delivers this speech, What It Means to Be Colored in the Capital of the United States, in Washington, D.C. on October 10th, 1906. And so, as I said, her goal was to debunk this myth that the increased presence of Black people in D.C. represented this the symbol of freedom, and really tried to showcase the realities of the Black experience. And so if you can drop the second link. And so the activity that I'd like us to do is in this link, you can see that there is, it's a copy of Terrell's entire speech. And so if you can, some of us might not be able to get to the whole speech, but maybe if you could read 3 to 5 paragraphs from What It Means to Be Colored in the Capitol, and then identify any rhetorical devices that Terrell is using. So if you see her using metaphor or simile or parallelism, any key themes that you notice, themes of racial justice, or any like historical references that she makes throughout the speech. You can annotate using the comments, so you can't necessarily edit the text, but you can annotate using the comments to share your specific insights into the persuasive nuances and these themes of the speech. You can also in the comments jot down any questions that you have or any reflections for a more comprehensive understanding. And then my hope is that we could reconvene in about 18 minutes and just have time to talk about the speech.
Back then they did it, forcefully and with everything that's going on. But now it seems like things are still happening, but now it's happening undercoverly. And it seemed like for me, this text, she was just asking for basic human rights. It's like she wasn't asking for like to be put on a pedestal. She wasn't asking like, hey, I want to be queen of work. She was asking for basic human dignity. Like everybody has the right to be treated fairly. Everyone has the right to walk around in the neighborhood who's supposed to be free for all in the representation of America and be able to be served. So I feel like that's what stood out to me. It's like she wasn't asking for much. She was asking just to be treated as a like human being.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Would anyone else, do you have any comments or first thoughts when you were looking at this speech, anything that stuck out to you?
Good afternoon, everybody. So I kept seeing references, although they didn't really use the word, to colorism. And I work at Dunbar High School, which is formerly the preparatory school for colored youth. That Mary Church Terrell, that Nanny Helen Burroughs, that her husband Robert Terrell worked at. And I do know about like different aspects of how colorism even came into America's first Black public high school, which is that school. And I think there might have been an alluding to one of the staff members in this particular speech who had to battle colorism a lot because she was not fair skinned. And so colorism is like one of those dirty laundry topics that even in the Black community, even in Black Washington, D.C., and the era of the Black bourgeoisie, that is not oftentimes like to be talked about, but it comes up a lot and has informed a lot of this history and the plight that has had to have been navigated around this country, but especially in DC.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. So to move to some questions that I had, and you can also chime in if you have any other comments or anything like that. This is just to keep the conversation going. Did you notice any like specific rhetorical devices that Terrell employed to really convey the realities of Jim Crow laws and racial discrimination in DC at this time? I noticed some folks have some stuff in the comments, so yeah.
I was surprised by the tone that she uses. Like she uses a lot of like lofty vocabulary in terms of her diction, but then in other moments she uses a lot of humor and satire, just mocking and dunking on racist white people. And I enjoyed the sass.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share any rhetorical devices that that she employed that you noticed? Okay. So I can move to the next question. So among the numerous accounts of discrimination highlighted by Terrell's speech, choose one that particularly resonated with you. Discuss why this specific instance stood out to you, considering its emotional weight, its relevance to the broader context of discrimination, and its implication within the narrative Terrell presents. So, yeah.
Hi. I really am happy that you shared this essay. I walked past the Mary Church Terrell building near Gallery Place, and I never knew the depth of her history. I knew a little bit, but I really like the story of having to be racially ambiguous. I think that's very relevant today. I put a little comment in there about her saying the little girl was Filipino instead of being Black, and how it was acceptable to be Filipino, but not acceptable to be Black, despite the color being the same. And I think that's very pertinent because we do have a lot of racial identities now, and it is almost easier to identify with another group of people than a group of Black Americans. And how that shows up for people who want to feel good about their history, feel good about themselves. But sometimes it is a device to survive. And in this case, for the father, he had to deny the little girl's Blackness in order for everybody else to have fun.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share maybe one of the instances that Terrell shares that really resonated with you or stood out?
I have one, I guess, that kind of connects back to what was just talked about in the concepts of like the racial ambiguity in the 10th paragraph, I think. It's talking about this woman who was very fair-skinned and went in for the job interview, and then that like racial ambiguity, the hiring person had to point blank ask what her race was, and she claimed it, and then in doing so it sort of it cost her the job, but it also forced this individual to directly state their own racist hiring practices in that regard, in a way that like that wouldn't have happened, I suppose, if they had just assumed her race instead. And so I found that pretty compelling.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing. Let's open. Would anyone else have any of the instances or stories that Terrell shares that really resonated with you?
I thought it was interesting to see like white resistance towards Black progress, like the fact that like boycotting was used to prevent like hiring Black folks at stores, and then the fact that like there's this interracial tension where she assumes that a Jewish person is going to have empathy for the Black experience and subvert racism in his own space, but he's not able to. And then also looking at, or able or willing, right? And then also looking at DC versus New York, and New York being more cosmopolitan and having more space for Black people versus DC, which is an interesting comparison.
That is a very interesting comparison. Thank you for sharing that. And so the last question that I'll ask, and I leave these here for you as a resource, is what parallels can be drawn between the challenges that Terrell highlights in this speech and more contemporary issues related to like social justice, racial discrimination, and equality. And so some folks have already spoke on this, but I want to give others an opportunity to highlight the connection between the past and the present.
The word that comes to mind in that regard is resistance. So like you may have in the history of this country, laws or policies that are passed that are supposed to make the condition better for Black people. But then you have all these different subtle, granular and even blatant levels, especially in the modern era, acts of resistance to the legal record. So if you think about, what Brown versus the Board of Education was supposed to achieve, and not that there was anything wrong with the actual legislation itself, but the resistance to actually having that legislation passed, that's only been 60-something years. We're not that far removed, and that's why we see the issues that we see today, even with the modern education system, with different levels of public worth and basic services and rights that all human beings are supposed to have. So it's always been this factor of resistance to change.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. The key theme of resistance and resistance to, changing these experiences, changing the discrimination and fighting for equality. Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on that? Any connections that you saw between the past and the present? And so thank you all for participating in this activity. This is one that I use with my students, and I normally will have them read the speech before class.
Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
teaching us.
Thank you all for coming to this.